He turned my worst moment into a spectacle, laughed while the whole room watched me fall. What he didn't know was that silence can be a hunting ground and patience a weapon. So I stopped shouting and started planning. When he finally heard the truth, it would arrive like a verdict. Asterisk, asterisk. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more powerful stories. The room smelled like cheap cologne and expensive wine, an odd combination. I'd learned to associate with corporate celebrations. It was the annual awards night, tuxedos, speeches, and the fake laughter that people use to dress up ambition. I'd been nominated for Rising Star after 12 brutal months of work that had cost me sleep and friendships. I'd rehearsed a short thank you if the name was called. I had imagined the applause, the glow of the spotlight, the silent acknowledgement that I had earned my place. When they called my name, the applause was real. For 2 flashing seconds, I stood in the light, the world shrinking to the warm halo and faces turned toward me. I stepped up to the podium, my palms still damp, and felt a tremor of triumph. Then Marcus grabbed the microphone from the host like a thief in plain sight. You know, he said, his voice loud enough for the whole ballroom and thick with that cruel grin he wore like armor. It's adorable when someone new gets a trophy for looking busy. Let's be honest, half of what she did was my idea. Don't we all love narrative over reality? Laughter, the kind that cuts deeper than knives because it's not aimed at you alone. It's a performance everyone feels invited to join. Camera flashes stuttered like sympathetic thunder as he leaned forward and added, "She's the queen of rehearsed performance." No one here knows how many times I saved that client from her. An experience, my chest seized. I remember my smile collapsing, my speech dissolving into gravel. Faces blurred. The host fumbled, the applause matting into awkward silence. Someone clapped too loudly on my left, the kind of noise that says, "Please, let's move on." My cheeks burned. A stranger touched my arm with that weak, embarrassed smile people offer when they don't know what else to do. So that was how it felt to be made small, in front of the whole place I wanted to belong to, reduced to a footnote in one man's joke. Marcus stepped down with the smugness of someone who just confirmed the world's hierarchy. The trophy burned my hand the way truth does when it's hot. I wanted to hurl it at him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. Outside, in the cool air, the laughter echoed against the glass. My phone was already buzzing. Texts, tweets, messages. Someone had filmed it. Of course they had. In an hour, a dozen tiny screens would replay my humiliation until the clips bled into everyone's memory. I went home that night and didn't cry. I made dinner, watched the news, and pretended my hands weren't trembling. I forced a smile at Mom when she called, shrugged off her concern as if it were a minor scrape. That's what humiliation does. It teaches you how to act normal. Even when your bones are raw. But beneath the practiced calm, something else was happening. The shock settled, and a clear thought emerged like a blade. If he wanted me small in public, then I'd be bigger in every private place he thought he owned. I could have blasted him right then, posted my own video, shouted the truth until the feeds flipped. I could have begged sympathy or filed a complaint and let the machinery of PR and workplace politics chew him up. Instead, the anger in me cooled into a plan so quiet it would be invisible until it struck. For days, I watched him like a scientist watches an experiment. Marcus was flamboyant at events, ruthless in meetings, the sort of man who mistook volume for merit. He touched everything as if ownership followed touch. But he left traces, always does. An offhand email to a vendor that omitted details. A signature on a contract that looked hurried. A credit line typed into a slide that wasn't his to claim. Greed leaves fingerprints in spreadsheets and offhand bragging in group chats. People who take credit seldom clean up their tracks. I started with the smallest things. I saved every message that mentioned my contributions. I downloaded meeting recordings. I quietly asked the junior designers for their drafts. They trusted me because I had always been the one to praise them, to share credit. I told no one what I was doing. Noise would ruin it. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't tell myself I was awake from fury. I told myself I was awake to gather facts. On a Tuesday night, I met Ajoa, our head of compliance, for coffee under the pretense of a networking chat. She was blunt, bright, and tired of watching Marcus skate past consequences on charm and swagger. He thinks he's untouchable, she said, stirring sugar, eyes sharp. But the higher they climb, the darker their shortcuts. I'll help you look where he thinks no one is looking. That was all the permission I needed. The map started to take shape. Client files that contradicted his heroic saves, emails where he took credit for strategies he'd authorized but never conceived, invoices that looked like favors disguised as consultancy. It was a crooked trail, but it was a trail. One evening, I opened my laptop to a message from an anonymous account. You don't need to shout. Silence carries a heavier weight. My mouth curved into a smile I didn't show anyone. The game had begun. And then, as I clicked through a folder that held a version of a major proposal, my original slides, with notes time-stamped and dated, I noticed something that made the breath catch in my throat. A late-night email from Marcus to a vendor arranged to backdate deliverables to make his cover story plausible. If true, it meant deliberate fabrication. If true, it meant leverage. I sat there until dawn, phone dark so no one could see the outline of my face. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, the plan sharpened. I didn't know yet how I would use this. I only knew one thing with a clarity that warmed and terrified me. When I finally moved, it would be silent. He would hear the collapse underneath him when it was too late, and that thought, quiet as it was, felt like the first breath after you've decided you'll be the person who ends the story. Your way, if you've ever watched someone rehearse for a play they never intended to perform, line by line, silence by silence. You know what a patient plan looks like. Mine wasn't grand, not a viral smear campaign, not a wrecking ball confrontation. Silence is a weapon only when it's used with precision. So I started with a ledger. First, the facts. If you want to dismantle someone who depends on theater and bravado, expose the plumbing of their performance, the contracts, the emails, the partner agreements, the payment trails. Theater collapses when you cut the ropes backstage. I opened a private account, burned a thumb drive with encrypted copies of everything I collected, and stored backups across 3 places people would never suspect. I spoke to the IT guy quietly as a friend about auditing access logs without mentioning names. He walked away with a puzzled brow and a promise. Small favors, spent carefully, are powerful. Meanwhile, Marcus kept playing his role. At the next board lunch, he took credit for a client renewal that, in reality, I had engineered. He told the story like a fable where he saved the day. Heads nodded. People loved a simple narrative. I recorded the conversation. He didn't change his tune. Then I began a campaign of quiet unraveling. Not lies and retaliation, facts, sourced and layered. I started by correcting attribution in places no one noticed. A design credit on the company site, a footnote in a white paper, a line in the monthly newsletter. Each small correction was a seed. People have short attention spans, but overlap facts form patterns that grow impossible to ignore. I asked an old client, Mrs. Dar, for a small favor. Would she give me a quote about the project we'd worked on the previous year, the one Marcus claimed to revive? She agreed, happy to help the person she considered thorough and honest. Her quote, published on our social channels under my byline, was the kind of public validation Marcus couldn't laugh away. I also started placing gentle questions in meetings, the kind that are like sand in an engine. Marcus, could you forward the original vendor approval? I just want to double-check the timeline for the audit. His smile thinned. He'd meant to bluff his way through, but when documents were requested, he hesitated. People watching saw his hesitation. In the world of swagger, hesitation is a small stone that becomes an avalanche dot at the same time. I met privately with a journalist friend, Omar, not to shame, but to tell a story about a systemic problem, credit stealing and creative leadership. I didn't hand over names. I framed it as an industry piece. He listened. He asked for examples. He asked to keep a line open. The truth is, dismantling a man like Marcus required more than rage. It required allies. My allies came in quiet forms. A junior designer who sent me a folder of original drafts without signatures. An old vendor who revealed that Marcus had signed off on inflated invoices in exchange for personal favors. The finance intern who had seen payments routed through a shell consultancy. None of them wanted headlines. They wanted fairness. A turning point arrived when I walked into a client meeting and saw the same slides. Marcus had presented in a later speech, my version, verbatim, with his annotations added like lipstick over bruises. I didn't call him out. I sipped my water, then asked, "Could you walk us through the research phase of these insights? I want to note contributors in the follow-up report." He hesitated, winked at others, and started recounting details he hadn't known. My question forced a fissure. Someone in the room, a quiet director, raised a hand and said, "I remember seeing a different draft circulated last week." It had Sophia's notes attached. Who was responsible for the final edit? Head swiveled. Marcus's voice stumbled. He smiled too wide. The director's look said, "This is odd." The first public ripple had formed. I didn't spike a drink or yell. I guided events like a chess player guiding pawns. The more factual threads I wove, the more people began to notice inconsistencies in the Marcus story. His defenses were built on speed and spectacle. Facts require time and patience. People started to ask questions. Someone in HR pinged me privately. We've had whispers. Nothing formal. Want me to help with an audit? I said yes. She asked for my timeline and my collected evidence. I sent it in a format that was professional, precise, and impossible to dismiss as spite. Then came the night that finally made the difference. I received an anonymous packet at my desk, an Excel spreadsheet with payment dates, vendor names, and a red line that showed a pattern. The same shell company getting regular consultation fees timed right before. Marcus celebrated big wins publicly. There was a note, "Follow the money." They never learned to hide it well enough. I stared at the numbers until morning dot within days. Accounting flagged anomalies. The CFO's eyebrow raised. An internal audit was quietly initiated, the kind that starts with one small question and ends with a list of uncomfortable revelations. Marcus didn't know how to silence the machine once it started, but he wasn't hopeless. He struck back in small, theatrical ways, a pointed email sent to our client list implying I was overly sensitive about recognition. A rumor floated to HR about emotional instability. He wanted to push sympathy away from me and back onto him. Classic tactic. Gaslight the victim into explaining their emotion while the abuser frames himself as the wounded party. I kept my calm. I replied in measured emails, copied the right managers, documented everything. The more he screamed theatrically, the smaller his voice became in official threads. The first public consequence came on a Wednesday, a quiet internal memo announcing a review of vendor contracts. No headlines, no dramatic press releases. But on the company intranet, the rumor mill slowed. People who'd been cheering a month ago found themselves uncomfortable. The applause thinned out late that night as I sat in my living room with the thick envelope of evidence beside me. My phone buzzed with a text from Omar. "If you're ready, I can run it." I have a reporter who will handle it responsibly. No sensationalism, just facts and documents. Your call. I stared at the screen long enough to feel old. Then I typed simply, not yet. Let them keep flapping, because the best part of silence isn't never speaking. It's choosing the precise moment when the quiet becomes a storm. I was ready to strike, but not until the structure he stood on had been quietly removed. And somewhere, in the dark corners of my office and the quiet threads of inboxes, the truth was being arranged into a form that could not be laughed away. That was when the email came from HR with the subject line, "Request for meeting, compliance review." My hands tightened around my mug. I straightened, inhaled, and walked into the next day knowing this. The first real crack had shown on stage. The second would come from the files. And the third, the one that would change everything, was about to fall. Question burning in my mind wasn't whether he would notice. It was when he would realize that silence had destroyed him while he was busy performing for applause. The HR office smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. Sunlight spilled across the long glass table, turning files into pale shadows. 3 people sat across from me: Aisha from compliance, the HR manager, and the CFO. Their faces were professional, neutral, like doctors preparing to diagnose something everyone already suspected. "Thank you for coming in." Sophia, HR began, her voice gentle but clipped. "This is a routine review of vendor contracts, and your name has appeared as a contributor on several files. We'd like you to clarify some points." I nodded, heart steady. "Of course. I keep detailed records. Do you want digital or hard copies?" Aisha's lips curved in a hint of a smile, just enough for me to know I wasn't alone. The CFO adjusted his glasses. "Let's start with the last quarter's projects," he said. "Marcus reported these as his initiatives, but the drafts and approvals seem inconsistent." I laid out my folder. Every page was dated, signed, timestamped. Every email had a thread that tied back to me. Silence filled the room as they compared signatures. Marcus's name appeared often, but usually on the final versions after my drafts had been completed. The CFO frowned. "It's unusual for a project lead to consistently attach their name late in the cycle." I said nothing. Silence is louder than denial when evidence lies in front of you. Aisha tapped her pen against the table and said, "We'll need to speak with Marcus directly." The next morning, they did. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I saw the aftermath in his eyes. He swaggered less, laughed softer. He still barked orders, but his voice had the brittle edge of someone playing a role for an audience no longer clapping. He cornered me in the hallway that afternoon, his breath hot, his smile stretched. "Funny how you've been so eager to show off your files lately," he said. "Almost like you've been waiting for this." I held his gaze. "I'm just doing my job." His smirk flickered. "Careful, Sophia. People don't like colleagues who play martyr. They start asking if you're stable." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I turned and walked away, letting my silence become its own insult. His laughter followed me down the corridor, loud, forced, the kind of noise a man makes when he's trying to convince himself he's still in control. But I knew the truth. His mask was cracking. And when a mask cracks, people start noticing the person beneath it. That night, I received another anonymous message: "You're doing well. But don't stop here. Look at the overseas accounts." Attached was a file, a string of transactions that showed Marcus had routed money into a consultancy registered abroad. It wasn't illegal on the surface, but the timing aligned perfectly with inflated vendor invoices. I sat back in my chair, the glow of my screen painting my face in cold light. The puzzle was nearly complete. Now I had not just proof of credit theft, but of financial manipulation. It wasn't just reputation anymore. It was survival. The silence was sharpening. And soon, it would cut dot by the end of the week. Whispers had spread. People avoided Marcus in the cafeteria. Conversations paused when he walked in. He noticed. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, his jokes fell flat. He was used to being adored or at least feared. Now he was becoming something worse. Ignored Dot, but Marcus wasn't finished. He doubled down. At the next company-wide meeting, he stood on stage with his familiar grin and said, I know there have been rumors, but let's remember who brought in the biggest contracts this year. Me. He raised his hands, waiting for applause. A few claps scattered like raindrops. Then silence. I watched from the back row as his face twitched. For a second, just a second, his mask slipped. The silence mocked him louder than laughter ever could. That night, I met Omar again. We sat in a dim cafe, the city buzzing outside. He leaned forward, eyes sharp. Sophia, I've seen the files. This isn't just workplace drama. It's fraud. If we publish, it'll make waves. I stirred my coffee slowly. Not yet. The company needs to take the first step. If I go public now, it'll look personal. I want this to be undeniable, their decision, not my revenge. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. You're colder than most people I interview. I smiled faintly. Cold keeps you alive. 2 days later, HR summoned Marcus again. This time, he shouted. People heard him down the corridor. You're accusing me without proof. This is a witch hunt. But the walls had ears, and ears spread stories. Soon everyone knew. The mighty Marcus was flailing, and then came the moment I had been waiting for. The CFO called an emergency board meeting. Marcus strutted in, tie sharp, hair slicked back, pretending confidence. But as the presentation began, slide after slide showed discrepancies, timelines, signatures, and finally, the overseas transactions. His face drained of color. This is a mistake, he stammered. Someone's framing me. The CFO leaned forward. Then explain why these payments align with your approvals. Silence. Real, suffocating silence. For the first time, Marcus had no performance to hide behind. I sat at the far end of the table, watching, saying nothing. The silence I had carried for weeks finally bloomed in the room. It pressed down on him until he broke. You think she's innocent? He spat suddenly, pointing at me. She's been out to get me since that stupid awards night. She's manipulating all of you. Every head turned toward me. My heart raced, but my voice was calm. I've only ever done my work. The files speak for themselves, and they did. The evidence was undeniable. The board dismissed him from the meeting. Not officially fired, not yet. But suspended pending investigation? That word was enough. Suspended. The storm had arrived. And he was at its center dot, but as I walked out of the room, I knew this wasn't the end. Marcus was the kind of man who fought even when cornered. And a cornered man is dangerous. Which meant my silence would need to become even sharper because the final blow hadn't been delivered yet. And when it was, he wouldn't see it coming. The office had changed. People no longer rushed to greet Marcus in the hallways. His desk, once a hive of constant traffic, now sat quiet. Papers piled, calls went unanswered. He still strutted, still laughed too loudly, but it was the laughter of a predator who knows the forest has grown quiet and not in his favor. I felt his eyes on me more, often, watching, calculating. He lingered in the pantry when I arrived, smirked as I poured my coffee, whispered to colleagues when I walked past. The intimidation was transparent, but the silence around him made it sting less. No one defended him. No one joined in. He was alone, though he pretended otherwise. Then one evening, I found an envelope on my desk. My name written in harsh strokes. Inside, photos. Me with Omar in the cafe. Me handing him a folder. A typed note read, "How professional does this look? What will HR say when they find out you've been leaking company files to the press?" I stared at it, my chest tightening. He'd followed me. He had proof, or at least the illusion of it. Enough to twist perception, enough to strike back. I tucked the envelope away, my mind racing. Omar was safe. I hadn't given him anything yet, but Marcus didn't need truth. He needed suspicion, and suspicion is poison in corporate corridors. That night, I called Omar. "He knows," I whispered. "He's watching us, then let him watch," Omar replied. His voice was steady, firm. "If he wants to play with shadows, give him a spotlight he can't escape." "You have the proof, Sophia." "Use it," I hesitated. Revenge is sweet in theory, but bitter when it consumes your life. What if they believe him before they believe me? "Then," Omar said, "you let his lies dig his own grave. The silence you've been wielding, keep it. Don't rush. Let him unravel." The next morning, Marcus strode into the office with fresh energy. He laughed louder, clapped shoulders harder. He thought he'd regained control. And maybe for a moment he had. He whispered to HR, lingered with managers, passed me with a smug half-smile, but what he didn't know was that while he tried to weaponize shadows, I was preparing the spotlight Omar had promised, because silence, when timed perfectly, doesn't just protect you. It destroys your enemy. The board's investigation was underway, and Marcus knew it. He submitted defensive emails, drafted memos late into the night, and stormed into HR with files clutched in sweaty hands. Each attempt at control only deepened his paranoia. The walls were closing in, and he could feel them pressing against his ego. Meanwhile, I played my role perfectly. Quiet, diligent, unshaken. I came in on time, left on time, delivered my projects flawlessly. My silence wasn't retreat. It was a mirror. Every frantic move he made reflected his guilt, while my calm presence highlighted his instability. But Marcus wasn't stupid. He knew silence was my weapon, and he tried to break it out one evening. As I packed up, he appeared in the doorway. His smile was sharp, his tie loosened. "Late night again, Sophia?" he asked casually. "You know, people might start wondering why you're here after hours so often. Who you're meeting, what you're hiding." I looked up slowly. "Are you projecting, Marcus?" His jaw twitched. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing victim, gathering sympathy. But you and I both know you've been feeding that journalist. If I fall, I'll drag you with me." I met his gaze, steady as stone. "Then drag me." The words hit him harder than I expected. For the first time, he blinked, thrown off balance. He wanted fear, panic, a crack in my mask. But silence met his threat. And silence unnerves men like Marcus more than anger ever could. The next day, I made my move. I scheduled a private meeting with the CFO. No dramatics, no accusations, just a simple presentation. I showed him the overseas transactions, the inflated invoices, the timeline. I showed him how Marcus's signature always appeared just before funds were diverted. And then, carefully, I laid down the anonymous message trail I had received. The CFO listened, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he said only, "Leave this with me." That was enough. A week later, the boardroom doors closed again. Rumors spread fast. Marcus had been summoned for a final review. No one smiled at him as he passed. No one offered comfort. He walked alone, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the silent corridor. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to. Silence had carried me this far. Silence would finish the job. Hours later, the news rippled through the office. Marcus had been terminated. Not suspended, not warned, terminated. His access revoked, his badge deactivated. He stormed out with a box of belongings, shouting, blaming, cursing. But his voice, once a weapon, now sounded pathetic against the silence that met him. I watched from my desk as he exited the building. The man who once humiliated me in front of hundreds, now left stripped of power, reputation, and control, and I hadn't said a single word. The morning after Marcus's termination, the office buzzed like a hive of freed bees. Whispers floated in every corner. Did you see his face when security walked him out? I knew something was off about those contracts. Can you believe he thought he'd get away with it? I sat at my desk, quiet as ever, sipping my coffee. My silence had shifted shape. It was no longer a shield against humiliation, now it was a crown. The same people who once avoided eye contact with me now glanced in my direction with subtle respect. No one said it out loud, but I could feel it. They knew I had stood tall while Marcus fell apart. That afternoon, an HR manager stopped by. Sophia, the board would like to thank you personally. Your composure through all this was admirable. Her tone was measured, but her eyes betrayed something else. Admiration mixed with relief. Later, Omar texted me, heard the news. He's out. Proud of you. I stared at his message, a faint smile tugging at my lips. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't thrown accusations. Marcus had destroyed himself with the very tactics he thought would save him. But silence has ripples. And those ripples spread far beyond the office walls. That evening, I received a notification, a new article by Omar's outlet. Corporate Wolf exposed, the hidden scandal of Marcus Holley. The story laid bare everything, the fraudulent contracts, the intimidation, the attempted cover-ups. Names of investors, details of shady deals, and carefully verified evidence. It didn't mention me. Not once, and that was the beauty of it. My silence wasn't just revenge. It was protection. Marcus was ruined, and my name remained spotless. Days later, LinkedIn was ablaze with speculation. Marcus's connections severed ties, companies issued statements. Even old colleagues resurfaced to share warning stories about his temper. His downfall wasn't just professional, it was public. And through it all, I stayed silent because sometimes silence doesn't just end a battle. It echoes so loudly, it drowns out an entire empire. Weeks passed and Marcus disappeared from the industry. His once polished profile photo vanished from social media, replaced by whispers of lawsuits and debts. The man who humiliated me in a conference hall now avoided the very world he once dominated, but my story wasn't over. One evening, as I walked home, I passed a small cafe. In the corner, hunched over a laptop, sat Marcus. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by a crumpled shirt. His once slicked hair hung loose, his face drawn with exhaustion. For a moment, our eyes met. Recognition flared, then shame. He looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the screen. But the silence between us spoke volumes. He didn't shout. He didn't sneer. He didn't dare. I walked past him without a word, my heels clicking against the floor. Each step was a reminder. Silence had stripped him of his power, his pride, his identity. Later, I learned he had tried to apply to smaller firms, but no one would touch his name. The article followed him everywhere. The whispers grew louder. His arrogance had turned into infamy, and his network had collapsed like a house of cards. Meanwhile, my career flourished. The board offered me a promotion, clients sought me out, colleagues leaned on me for leadership. I accepted with grace, never once mentioning Marcus, because my victory wasn't in boasting. It wasn't in revenge shouted from rooftops. It was in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the man who once humiliated me had destroyed himself. And all I had to do was let the silence speak for me. In the end, silence wasn't just my shield. It was my weapon, my justice, my legacy. And Marcus, He became nothing more than a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a man silenced forever by the very arrogance that once made him. Roar, silence may be powerful, but it is also heavy. After Marcus's downfall, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment many nights, staring at the city lights through the window. Victory tasted sweet, yes, but it also carried an aftertaste I hadn't expected, because when the noise fades, all that remains is you and your thoughts. I replayed the day of my humiliation, his mocking voice, the way people laughed under their breath, the sting of shame that burned my cheeks. Those memories had fueled me, but they had also carved scars deep inside me. Sometimes silence isn't peace. It's holding in words that beg to be spoken, screams that want to escape. I had chosen silence as my weapon, but in the quiet, I had to confront myself. Omar was the only one who understood. One evening, as we walked through the park, he said, "You know, you didn't just destroy Marcus. You proved something bigger, that restraint, patience, and dignity are stronger than arrogance." I looked at him, the cool night air brushing against my face. "But it still hurts," I whispered. "No matter how much he lost, I can't forget what he did to me." Omar nodded slowly. "That's the thing about humiliation. You don't erase it, you outgrow it. And you did. You stood taller than him. That's why he fell. For the first time in months, I felt my chest loosen. Maybe silence wasn't just my weapon. Maybe it was also my healing. But healing comes with one last test. And mine was still waiting for me. Happened unexpectedly. Months after his fall, I was invited to speak at a leadership summit. The hall was grand, filled with professionals, entrepreneurs, and students eager to learn. As I walked onto the stage, applause filled the air, a sound that once would have terrified me, but now felt like a balm. I began to speak about resilience, about dignity in the face of adversity, about how silence can be strength when used with intention. And then, at the back of the hall, I saw him. Marcus. He was sitting alone. In a shadowed corner, his presence almost ghost-like. No entourage, no allies, no smug grin. Just a man hollowed out by his own downfall, listening to the very person he once tried to break. Our eyes met just for a heartbeat. This was it. The final moment. The chance to say everything I had bottled up. To spit back the words he once used to humiliate me. To make him feel the sting of shame in front of a crowd. But I didn't. I smiled softly, continued my speech, and never once acknowledged him again. Because true revenge isn't about repeating the humiliation. It's about showing that you no longer need revenge at all. When I walked off the stage to a standing ovation, Marcus slipped out quietly, unnoticed, unseen. A man erased not by my words, but by my silence. That night, as I stood on my balcony, the city glowing beneath me, I finally breathed freely. The chapter was closed. Not with noise, not with fury, but with silence, the kind that echoes forever.